and welcome to a follow-up episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. It is, Wednesday, April 15th, 2020. It's a little bit delayed in getting to the second part of this hot take on President Uchtdorf's talk from the 2020 April General Conference. Life happens. In the meantime, we're all kind of stuck in our quarantines. And so it's taken me a little bit to get back to this. But let's see if we can rejoin President Uchtdorf where we left off. Now, if you saw the first half of this, then you will know that he started his talk sort of giving a little bit of mild praise to President Nelson for putting together this conference. It's a special conference because they are isolated in an area. Only the general authorities who are speaking were brought into the conference, and they're in this auditorium keeping distance from each other and broadcasting their talks out over the internet. And we got to hear him talk about people who left the church being like unruly children who, like spoiled brats who didn't get their way, pack their bags and leave, declaring that they'll never return. And he says this in sort of a paternalistic way, kind of assuring the members that if they stay faithful, eventually these unruly children will wise up to the real gospel and will return. And you can look at part 1 for some of the comments around that. We're going to go ahead and finish out his talk and then see if we can get some calls so that people can discuss their own feelings on the issue and see how it's affected other people. So let us continue. We will bring the good brother Dieter back. I've done some tweaking with the audio to try to make this a little bit better, but we'll see how it works. All right, let's go.
We're pilgrims walking the road of mortality in a grand search for meaning and ultimate truth. Often, all we see is the path directly ahead. We cannot see where the bends in the roads will lead. Our loving Heavenly Father has not given us every answer. He expects us to figure out many things for ourselves. He expects us to believe, even when it's difficult to do so. He expects.
So, I think here Dieter is kind of casting the spell of, when the brethren don't live up to their promises as prophets, seers, and revelators, this is how you can understand that in a way that helps you to maintain faith in them. And that is that God doesn't give us all the answers. We don't have perfect knowledge of things. And, I think that is true to some extent. The difference is when you go back and you read church history and you read the accounts of Joseph Smith and the type of revelation that he was willing to say God gave him directly, you'll see that God was, talking about all sorts of ridiculous things. When I say ridiculous, I mean in the grand scheme of the issues and challenges facing humanity. If God, the divine, perfect creator of the entire universe, was going to communicate things to you, it wouldn't be about, building a hotel, the Nauvoo house. It wouldn't be about, there's some gold in this widow's basement that you were going to get that we just couldn't find. If you look in Doctrine and Covenants, section 111, you'll find the story about that. The unruly children who packed their bags and left did so because when they looked at the disparity between the promises of the prophet, seer, and revelators in this church, and when they looked at, who God is and what you would expect from a God, that it completely is disconnected. Just as people who leave any other high-demand religion who has a central figure of authority claiming to represent God do things that are against his own teachings, do things that betray any real communication with God, make predictions that are completely disconnected with real-life events, or fail to prepare people for things that, if there was some sort of notion of prophecy or seeing the future, should have been prepared for. All of those things cause people to leave, to wake up, to see that the emperor has no clothes, and realize that they no longer need to depend on this charlatan for their own spiritual existence, for their own state of well-being. they don't have to tie their salvation to these men claiming false authority, because they can go out and make their way on their own, find their own answers using their own judgment and their own connection to the divine, if that is the framework that they want to shape their lives in, or their own conscience. So Dieter can say what he wants to in this regard, and it will play to people who never have crossed that threshold where they see that the brethren have no legitimate authority. But if he's trying to actually reach out to people who have left the church and make a case for them to come back, this is going to fall very, very flat. All right, let's keep going.
Expects us to straighten our shoulders and develop a little resolve, a little backbone, and take another step forward. That is the way we learn.
Okay, so we need to go back to the thing he said right before this, and then put that in the context here.
Straighten our shoulders and
let's
see
see
where the bends in the roads will lead. Our loving Heavenly Father has not given us every answer. He expects us to figure out many things for ourselves. He expects us to believe, even when it's difficult to do so. He expects us to straighten our shoulders and develop a little resolve, a little backbone, and take another step forward.
So those are all great bits of ammunition that will be used to shift blame to members. Because when you start to find that the answers that the brethren don't give you match up, and you go to leaders or to other people who feel like they can help doubting members, they're going to be able to say, well, you need to get a backbone. You need to be stronger. You need to, the whole notion that it's, you have to believe even when it's hard to believe. What that is saying is that when something betrays your conscience of logic and reason, that's when it's hard to maintain belief. And that is the time which you have to suppress your mind, suppress your heart, and replace it with what the brethren impose on you as God's reality. That's when it's hard. That's when you have to do it. And it's President Ballard called it the bending of the soul. And if you search, there's a video that addresses this subject on the Thinker of Thought's YouTube channel. But it's, they're not asking you to, grow a backbone and really work to believe in the church when it's talking about things like be nice to your neighbor, help people who are in need. There's no challenge. It doesn't take any strength to maintain belief in the idea that it's a good thing to help your neighbors or to help those in need. It's only when they are telling you need to see people who are gay as broken. Yes, they're still children of our Heavenly Father and they have their own special challenges, but they just need to remain celibate and not enjoy the full measure of the existence on this earth until the end. They need to endure to the end, and then they'll be fixed in the twinkling of an eye. They'll have that aspect of their nature fixed. Those are the things, particularly if you have a loved one, a son or a daughter who is gay. And then you realize that the narrative that they are prescribing for these people doesn't match. The remedy that they are prescribing, it cuts people's lives off at the knees, if not the heart. And that's not a reality that you want to accept for your loved one. That's when it's hard to believe. And that's when he's telling you, even when it's hard to believe, believe. And you've got to have a backbone and you've got to be strong and do it. And if you don't, then you're weak and you have no backbone and you're not pulling yourself up by your, faith bootstraps or whatever. So
that is the way we learn and grow. Would you honestly want everything spelled out in every detail? Would you honestly want every question answered? Every destination mapped out? I believe most of us would tire very quickly of this sort of heavily micromanagement.
Well, see, the problem is he's conflating two different things. People don't want, he's calling the yearning that people have for definitive answers on certain subjects micromanagement. And it's not micromanagement. People are asking for answers in the context of the church, answers to the difficult issues. Well, how is it that Joseph Smith is a prophet, but he married his foster children secretly behind the back of his wife. That doesn't make any sense with what we understand the gospel and the nature of marriage to be. How is it that he did these things and he lied to the public? These are answers that the if people are asking the questions, these are the answers that actually mean something because of the implications for the answer. If they provide an answer that actually reaffirms faith and reaffirms the notion that Joseph Smith was a prophet and that these revelations came from God, then it helps people to work through their faith. But if the only answers are available are, well, he was a charlatan and he did things that if you saw some crazy nut job religionist offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists do, you would totally say he's a total charlatan and don't pay attention to anything he says. The church can't provide these answers, and so they have to say, we don't want micromanaging. We can't provide all the answers. You'd get bored if the answers were all there. No. But that's what they have to say because they have to take the institutional equivalent of pleading the Fifth Amendment. And that is, if they were to give you the answers that make the most sense, that would apply to any other individual around these issues, that answer would completely invalidate the claims of the church in terms of the authority of its founder, which would imply that the authority of all of the other leaders since him claiming to be the mouthpiece for God is defunct, which means that all of the dependence that people place upon these men to proclaim the will of God, to set up the framework for their own salvation, all of those things are completely rubbish. So, yes, the church is not going to provide the answers. You don't want to have all those answers provided because those answers remove our control over your mind and heart. So you need to be okay with that. We don't want you don't want to be micromanaged.
We learn the important lessons of life through experience, through learning from our mistakes, through repenting.
It's interesting that I think one of the best examples that I've seen is the Mormon Stories interview with Donna Showalter. If you get a chance to go back and watch that, it's a very long-form interview, and it includes a discussion with her son who came out as gay. And when you listen to her talk about her journey, she describes her mindset at the very beginning of her journey when she first, I think even before she learned that her son was gay. And it's very much a very obedience-oriented framework. She describes, what is right and wrong? Well, what do the brethren say? What does the gospel say? That's all she has to do. That's all she has to think about is just what do the brethren say? And it's a very black and white kind of single neuron way of looking at the world and placing values on people and on principles in the world. As you listen to her describe her journey, she had to wrestle with the reality of her son as a gay individual, dealing with what the church was telling her, dealing with the changes that the church was making in terms of the November 2015 policy, and how she wrestled with those things, learning about Joseph Smith's polygamy, learning about all these different things. And by the end of it, she is able to articulate the way that she looks at the world, at individuals, at moral questions and issues of the time in a way that shows such remarkable development in her own way of analyzing, processing, and assessing these moral questions. And it's so much more nuanced and complex and taking into account things that are completely foreign to the vocabulary of the brethren in terms of finding value and worth in people in all of their variety of differences. And when you look at that journey, then you can see that the process of learning and maturity and development that goes on in leaving the church is one that is completely closed off to people who remain in that framework of what is right and wrong. Well, what do the brethren say? What the brethren have written down, i.e. the scriptures, say? You can develop and grow and mature in that box that is the church, but you're always going to be confined by the limitations that the brethren allow you. These are the thoughts that are allowed. These are the things that you are able to tolerate because we give you permission to tolerate. And that measure of growth is a stunted and restricted form of growth. When you go and you look at people who study high demand religions in other contexts, things that we would consider cults, destructive cults, or just high demand religions that have an undue measure of control over the minds and choices and decisions of their followers, there is a form of infantilization that is always present. And it's something that the leaders of these groups have to do. They will give their members a false sense of autonomy, but they will draw very strict boundaries over what they are able to choose. You can choose within a small menu of things that they give you. And the choices include, things very tangibly, from what you eat to what you wear to even ideas that you're able to accept and sources of information that you're able to accept. Well, the growth that he's talking about here, that it's people's responsibility to grow and this is how we learn, they only want you to learn within the parameters of what they define as acceptable. If you go through this process he's talking about, and part of your growth and learning is that you absolutely do not want to accept the false restrictions, the proprietary morality of these men, that is not the type of growth that they want you to have. Then they'll pull out the scriptures that say that to be learned is good, as long as you obey us, as long as you still follow what we say. Because if you go beyond that, then, well, you're prideful and you've been deceived by Satan. There's all sorts of ammunition that they have to turn that against you.
And realizing for ourselves that wickedness never was happiness. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, died so that our mistakes might not condemn us and forever halt our progress. Because of him, we can repent, and our mistakes can become stepping stones to a greater glory. You don't have to walk this road alone. Our Heavenly Father.
This is one of the great things that they do, and it's part of the concept that certain religions tell you that you're broken and then sell you the cure that you need. And when you listen to this apostle Uchtdorf talk about the mistakes that you have made, then people look through what is the definition of a mistake, and they look at that question through the lens of the vocabulary of morality that they have been handed in the framework of the church. So somebody in the church, for example, who in their moment of separation from the gospel, they haven't been to church in a long time, they've been surrounding themselves with sort of an unsavory type of people, and those people have convinced them through peer pressure to drink coffee. That's just, then they now feel I've betrayed the word of wisdom. I'm no longer living up to my covenants, and I'm apart from the brethren. I'm not worthy. There's this less than worthy aspect of my nature. I'm broken. And that's where repentance can come in. Now, this is a very mild form. Certainly there are stronger forms of this, but this is just a principle, an idea, because that's how a Mormon would look at it. Now, if you talk to a former Jehovah's Witness or even a believing Jehovah's Witness, they'll look over at the Mormon who's sitting there racking himself with guilt over the fact that he's now addicted to cappuccinos, and they'll say that's ridiculous. Whether or not you choose to drink a cappuccino has no moral dimension to it at all, just as much as if you decided to choose to drink Sprite or water. Choosing to drink Sprite or water is just you have an affinity for a particular beverage. There's no moral dimension from that. Nobody is hurt by that. You've not trespassed against anybody. The only thing that you've trespassed against is a directive, a commandment, a proprietary, arbitrary commandment from somebody who claims authority to define what is right and wrong. Well, now let's flip the script on that. If you are a Jehovah's Witness and you're not attending your meetings, you step away and you start surrounding yourself with less than savory people, and you start doing things like playing video games, reading comic books. You may even decide to vote. Maybe you apply for community college or go and pursue higher education. Maybe, in a fit of iniquity and apostasy, when your wife is giving birth and has an unexpected bleed, you and her both consent to receiving blood transfusion in order to save her life. These are things that are all forbidden and considered to be apostasy and iniquity in the proprietary teachings, in the morality definition that the Jehovah's Witnesses have. And so as Mormons, we look at all of those things and we're like, well, that's ridiculous. You're not violating any moral transgression by doing any of those things. In fact, some of those things are really good. And so this, notion that Nelson has that you feel broken, he's talking to people who define their brokenness in the terms that the church has handed them. And that does not play once you have gone through the process of realizing that the morality that these men define simply capitalizes on universal concepts, universal moral concepts that everyone believes in. Sure, be nice. Don't steal, don't murder, don't rape. All of these universally accepted moral boundaries. The church can say, yeah, we teach these things. We teach good principles. Love your family. We teach good principles. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the only source of truth, because all these other religious organizations and even secular organizations teach the same things as moral principles. But then they add on a bunch of other things that have no root in actual morality, but are proprietary and are tied to their authority, because they'll tell you that the principle at the heart of this particular commandment is obedience. And that's why you can find video of Dale Renlund. One of the first talks he gave as a general authority was, acknowledging you can't get into a debate with someone over the word of wisdom on its health benefits, because they'll be able to bring out studies showing you some tangible health benefits to a glass of red wine every now and then, or to coffee. Instead, you have to explain that these moral principles, the word of wisdom, is about obedience. But we know that obedience in and of itself is not a moral principle. But by teaching it as a moral principle, these men are able to maintain control over people who only see their authority as the window through which they can look out at the world or look at themselves. And it's really widening and eliminating that window that allows people to grow and to mature and to see that type of deception for what it is.
Our Father has not left us to wander in darkness. This is why, in the spring of 1820, he appeared with his son, Jesus Christ, to a young man, Joseph Smith. Think of that for a moment. The God of the universe appeared to man. This was the first of many encounters Joseph had with God and other heavenly beings. Many of the words these divine beings spoke to him are recorded in the scriptures of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They are easily accessible. Anyone can read them and learn for themselves the message God has for us in our day. We invite you to study them for yourself. Joseph Smith was quite young when he received these revelations. Most of them came before he was 30 years old. He lacked experience, and to some people he probably seemed underqualified to be the Lord's prophet. And yet, the Lord called him anyway, following a pattern we find throughout the Holy Scriptures. God didn't wait to find a perfect person to restore his gospel.
Okay, so before we get to the imperfections of Joseph and how we should frame that, it's just interesting that he's inviting the world, member and non-member, to examine the prophecies, the revelations given to Joseph Smith. And so, what does it mean to have a revelation and you're Joseph Smith? Well, the whole reason why a man claiming to be a prophet is able to give revelations and why those revelations have power is because of the notion that these revelations are direct, authentic, legitimate communications from the Almighty God, the creator of the universe, the individual whose perfection defines our morality and our reality. And so, if Joseph Smith, the son of the failed ginseng farmer, treasure digger, tells you what he thinks right or wrong is, what he thinks the nature of the world is, and how you should be, you don't really take that. It's like, it's kind of like that that meme from the Big Lebowski. It's like, well, that's just your opinion, man. I can discard that and I have no issue. But if now he's induced me to believe that he speaks for God and that he's giving a statement made by the almighty, eternal, all-powerful God, well, then if I reject that and if I were to accept that that's really what's happening, then I'm not just rejecting Joseph, I'm rejecting God. And that's why these revelations have such power. And because of that type of power, the question of whether or not those revelations are real is the most critical question. Because throughout history, you can find men pretending to speak to God and to speak for God, having an understanding of the nature of the power of statements that they would put out under God's name and the influence that it can have over pious, believing, God-fearing people who just want to please God. That is a form of control that you can have because you understand that religious psychological lever. So this question of are these revelations real becomes very, very critical. And so that brings up the question of what are tools that any individual confronting any person claiming to speak for God can use to determine whether these revelations are real. And those tools are things that you need to pull from yourself, from your own concept of logic, from your own understanding of logic from any other position. And there's something that happened to me recently that's kind of like a parable for this, and that is I got a message from my bank saying that there are some unexplained charges, these charges and for stores I've never shopped at in completely different parts of the country. And I got this call and this message, and they said, we're going to validate your identity. We're going to send you a PIN number, and you need to respond to that. Well, if you Google right now on the types and extent of bank fraud that's out there, there are instances where scammers will call you pretending to be the bank, saying that there's been some sort of charge, and get some information from you. And then on their end, they're going to enter that information into a computer, into the real bank's website to try to pretend to be you saying that you want to reset things. And then they'll say, okay, and they'll do that. And then they'll say that the bank's going to send a confirmation number to the text number that you have. And then they'll ask you, we're going to send you a text. And so you'll be getting a communication from your actual bank thinking that the person you're talking with on the phone is your actual bank. But they're actually acting as an intermediary trying to get into your bank account and pretending to be the bank so that you'll give them that number that has been sent. So what they're doing is they're using this validation tool, but they're the one telling you how it works. And then you're going along with what they say. And they've subverted the validation so that it meets their needs. Now, if you step out of that and you say, wait a second, I need to go and look at this using tools of validation that I come up with myself, you can hang up with them, look for a completely authentic original source of your bank's contact information, contact your bank on your own, and then see if this is actually a legitimate thing from the bank in a way that you've connected with on your own. Well, some people say that this is kind of a paradigm for the problem with how the church deals with this issue of how do you know the revelations are true? Well, they give you their own little answer to the question of how you can know the revelation is true. Well, you pray about it hard enough and with good enough intent, and the Spirit will testify to you of the truthfulness of it. Well, that's an answer they've given you to the question of testing their own claim to authority, their own claim to legitimacy. Is it actually a real answer? Because a lot of people simply accept their tools for validating, their epistemological tools for validating this knowledge, this claim to legitimacy, and they accept it as real and don't examine the fact that this type of emotional logic, emotional reasoning, is something that is very easily manipulated. It's something that is predictable, and it's calculated. There's a whole industries in marketing and advertisement that understand how the cherished ideas and ideals around people's family, love, and emotion can be tapped into in making commercials to try to bind people to a particular brand because they felt something when they watched a commercial. Well, that same feeling, that mythology of truth, can be used and is used by the church to provide some form of validation for what they do. And he's just reinforcing that right here. And what you've got to do is you've got to step away from their tools of validation because of this question of, are these revelations actually real? Are they from God? And you've got to use a set of tools that aren't handed to you by the people claiming the things that you're testing in the first place. And you've got to challenge them. And this set of tools that you use, you need to know that it works. So if you were to apply it to some other religious fanatic claiming to speak for God, then you can, if those tools prove that they're fraudulent, and these tools could be things like, does the leader contradict himself in things that he says God says? Does the leader secretly pursue actions that he publicly denounces as immoral, but he makes exceptions in his own private life? Is he claiming that God is saying things that, if it's in the past, things that should be universal things, but things that are rooted in errors of humanity's past, such as racism? All these different things would be huge red flags in some other religious charlatan. Now, if you take the set of tools, these different questions, these different assessments, and you apply them towards the leaders of the church, and particularly towards the statements that they attribute to God, not to themselves. Don't believe it because this comes from me, Joseph. Believe it because God said it. If this same tools would completely invalidate what Joseph would say, you then have to deal with that issue. And you have to be aware that the church is going to try to get you to do a special exception for Joseph because he's a real prophet and all those other prophets were not real. But if that is not something that you would accept in one of these other faiths, then you are left with a problem accepting it with Joseph. And there's an article called "Fix Your Faith Crisis" or your faith. I forget this. Fix your crisis of faith with one simple tip or something like that. I can't remember the exact title of it, but it's a deeper exploration of this concept that you will be handed tools to deal with your faith crisis. And some of those tools are, we consider them simply ways of overcoming doubt. They're not tied to any real logic. All they're simply aimed at is overcoming the doubt that you're feeling that's causing your faith crisis. And other tools are tools that really allow you to escape from a false, deceptive paradigm of faith that some religious organization is using to control you. And when you see the difference between those tools and you apply them to other faiths and then apply them to your own faith, that's where you can really decide whether or not you're being handed tools that are meant to keep you trapped or things that are really meant to let you grow and to learn. All right. So let's continue.
If he had, he would still be waiting. Joseph was a lot like you and me. Though he made mistakes, God used him to accomplish his great purposes. President Thomas S. Monson often repeated these words of advice: whom the Lord calls, the Lord qualifies. The Apostle Paul reasoned with the saints in Corinth. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. God uses the weak and the plain to bring about his purposes. The truth.
Okay, so this is President Uchtdorf's version of give brother Joseph a break, which is a famous statement made by a different apostle, Anderson, earlier in this decade. And that's that the apostles know that people are struggling with the reality of Joseph Smith's problems in his character. And what they're telling people is, you may see his problems of character as completely impeaching his claims to be a prophet of God, but just take all those concerns, throw them away, and give brother Joseph a break. And President Uchtdorf is adding a dimension to this, which is that nobody's perfect, and Joseph isn't perfect. And it's almost because God takes the humble, small things of the world and accomplishes great tasks. It's almost like that imperfection of Joseph is a testament to the reality of his prophetic nature and his prophetic standing. Because, there are no perfect people for God to call upon. And so if he takes somebody who's just even, he's simple, he has no education, he's got personal flaws, well, that makes his calling even more special and more divine. The problem is that we don't accept that type of thinking in any other critical aspect of our lives. If you've worked your entire life and you've saved up for your retirement, and you've got $10,000, $20,000, $100,000 that you're saving for your retirement, and you've got some people who say, come and invest with me. Give me that fraction of your life, which is defined by the time and effort and money you put to save that money away. Give it to me and I will be the steward of it and I will help it to grow. And you say, okay, well, let me look at your credentials as somebody who is going to be someone I trust this investment of my life with. Oh, well, you used to be a con man? You used to defraud people? Why in the world would I trust you? Nobody's perfect. You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. So if nobody's perfect, then you should trust me with your money. That type of thinking absolutely makes no sense because they have proven that they are not worthy of trust by their past deceptive practices, particularly when the things that they are claiming now are absolutely dependent upon somebody having trust and being worthy of that trust. There's a famous interview between Elder Holland and a BBC reporter where he asks him about the translation of the Egyptian papyri. And this is important to a lot of people because Joseph Smith claimed to be providing authentic translation into English of these ancient hieroglyphics. And nobody knew how to translate them back then. But when we learned how to translate hieroglyphics, and it was discovered that what Joseph claimed those hieroglyphics meant had absolutely nothing to do with it. It was completely fabricated. Well, then to most people, they would say, wait a second, this means that that man's claim to translate by the power of God was a lie, a deception. And to the extent that he used that lie and deception to induce other people to follow him, to believe in him, and to pay him money, then it was fraud. And so the BBC reporter confronts Elder Holland with that, and Holland's response is, well, I have no idea how Egyptian is translated. It was done by the power of God. It has nothing to do with the character of Joseph. Well, no, it has everything to do with the character of Joseph, because if he was defrauding people, then it means that you can't trust anything that he said as coming from God. And if you take the possibility that he is making up stuff that, oh, God told me to do that, then it suddenly makes sense that he would say that God told him to take other men's wives or the wives of other men as his own secret brides in secret. It would make sense that God told him to tell other people to give him money so he could build a hotel that he would personally profit from. It would make sense that God told him to, have the church support him so that he can do his churchly stuff and not have to work. all of these things are things that would benefit him personally, that if he just tried to tell people to do on his own, hey, could you do this for me? Then people would be like, no, I have to work hard every day. You need to work hard every day. He asks a 14-year-old girl to marry him. She says no. That's fine. But then he can say, well, God said that your whole family will be saved. Well, suddenly she has a powerful reason to say yes. But you take away that God element of it, you realize that he's just using a false notion that he speaks for God in order to get things that personally benefit him. And so you can read, as Uchtdorf has invited us to do, read the Revelations, particularly read Doctrine and Covenants section 132, and ask yourself if God would actually command this, or if some man who was very capable of creating scripturally sounding things that draw upon the Bible in order to get what he wants constructed it. Read Doctrine and Covenants section 111 and ask yourself if this does not reveal that he's really just trying to use the voice of God to cover up his own mistakes, when previously he thought that he was going to get the gold in some widow's cellar. There's all sorts of things that are revelations, but they're not revelations of the voice of God to us. They're revelations to us about the nature of Joseph Smith's deception because of what is in those revelations. All right. I just hate hearing this stuff from Uchtdorf, because we all like to think of Uchtdorf as kind of a guy who gets it, who is much more in a mode of latching on to the healthy, positive aspects of religion and not worrying about the things that tend to divide people or to put people in a position where they have to condemn their own thoughts, their own minds, their own hearts in order to continue to submit to the religion. Well, he's doing that here.
Truth stands as a testimony that it is God's power, not man's, that accomplishes his work on the earth. When God appeared to Joseph Smith, he introduced his son, Jesus Christ, and said, "Hear him." Joseph spent the rest of his life hearing him and following him. As with Joseph, our discipleship begins with our decision to hear and follow the Savior, Jesus Christ.
Okay, well, I tend not to dwell on the differences in the first vision accounts as a compelling argument for the difficulties and the problems with the church. I think one of the most powerful cases that can be made why it's important to pay attention to those differences are people who have laid out the timeline of each of the different accounts and compared it with statements that Joseph Smith made, which he did not attribute to God, but just attributed to himself. And the problem is that when you look at the timeline, there are things that he would say came from himself, such as the idea that all these churches probably have it wrong, that then in a later accounting of the first vision, he doesn't say that idea came to him from himself. He says that God himself communicated that idea to him in the first vision account. And the problem with that is that shows a pattern of taking things that he thinks of himself and then later saying, well, God told me that. And not only that, but I had never thought about it at all until God told me. I had never thought that all the churches were false until God told me, when later he had already stated that he didn't think that any of the churches were true. Because that pattern of taking things that you think of yourself and then later attributing them to God is something that we see in the way that he approached his plural marriage stuff. We see that as a common deception. If you were to look at Jim Jones or some other religious charlatan and then find in his journal he's writing things that he thinks, he's like, I think this, I think this, I think this. And then you listen to a sermon the next week and he says, God himself came down and told me this. You say, well, hold on a second. In your journal, it says that you were thinking of these things, and now you're telling me God came down and told you these things? You're simply using the paradigm of God's communication to get me to accept your personal opinion with divine authority. That's total bunk. Well, this difference, this aspect of the first vision accounts reveals that same pattern. And defenders of the church will say, well, the way that Revelation works is that God speaks to your mind, so it would make sense that it was coming into his mind. The difference is, if that's the case, then this first vision account is pointless, and the changes in the first vision account don't allow for that. And so it's understandable that Uchtdorf is tying into the first vision account, because this is a special general conference commemorating the 200th anniversary of that supposed vision. But again, he's relying on people not to really think it through and not to be aware of or understand the problems with those accounts.
If you desire to follow him, gather your faith and take upon yourselves his cross.
That's the other thing is, so he gave us a pattern of behavior. Joseph Smith heard Christ in the first division and then spent the rest of his life following us, just as we as members must learn to hear Christ and then spend the rest of our life following it. And the unspoken thing there is that the brethren are telling you, because they claimed to be the prophets, seers, and revelators, the mouthpieces of God on the earth. They're the ones who tell you what Christ/God says. And so it's a way for them to sort of take themselves out of the equation, so you don't see it for the imposition that it is. Say, follow God. But then in another talk later, they'll say, whether it is by, God has said, whether it is by my own voice or the voice of my servants, it is the same. And you can find that in the revelations that he told you to study before, Doctrine and Covenants, section 1. And so that the whole system is set up for these men claiming to speak for God to have power and control over your conscience, over your worldview, over your mind, over your self-concept, because you have to learn to listen to God, but they are the ones who tell you what God says.
You will find that you do belong in his church, a place of warmth and welcoming, where you can join in the grand pursuit of discipleship and happiness. It is my hope that in this bicentennial year of the first vision, as we contemplate and learn of the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ, we will realize that it is not just a historical event. You and I play a crucial part in this great continuing story. What then is your and my part?
Well, that's a good question. I just want to comment on his phrase, and we hear this a lot now, of part of our, I guess what the fruit they're dangling out in front of people is that we can continue on our quest for discipleship. And it's one of those things where growing up, when I was learning the Bible, I didn't really know the difference between an apostle and a disciple, because the disciples seemed to always be around Christ and the apostles were. But there was this difference. The people who had authority were the apostles, and then everybody who followed them were disciples. Well, we've got this thing now where discipleship in and of itself is the goal. Discipleship. But in the church, and he's telling you to come to the church and you will belong. And then you can pursue discipleship there. But the discipleship that they're talking about is only a discipleship that is tied to obeying them as leaders of the church. And members of the church will say, no. We're only talking about discipleship to God. Okay. If that is the case, then in your temple recommend interview, you should be free to tell the bishop and the stake president that you do not consider the prophet or the apostles or any of the church leaders to have any bearing on your soul. You don't have to listen to them. All you have to do is listen to God, and the only person that you are committed to follow is God. And they should be okay with that. And when they say, do you have a testimony of the restoration of the gospel? Well, the restoration is something defined by Joseph Smith, and it's not inherent to God himself. And you should be able to say, I don't have a testimony of the restoration of the gospel. I just have a testimony of God. And that is something that I define without having to frame my notion of God through the definitions that these men gave me. And you should be okay with that. But that is not something that the church allows, because the discipleship that they're talking about is not simply a connection to God on your own terms. It is a connection to God on terms that they give you under a network and framework of authority that they place you at the bottom rung on. And the issue that people have when they decide to leave that framework is not that they're on the bottom rung of the authority, it's that that authority and that hierarchy exists in the first place. If your goal in life is to connect with God in a mode of discipleship, then men claiming the things that these guys claim are completely superfluous and irrelevant. Because God is not going to talk through such men in a way that is contradictory, that is self-serving, that is inherently immoral through any other moralistic lens. The things that Joseph Smith got people to do only because he was a prophet. When you listen to, in particular, the documented evidence we have about how he approached women for polygamy. And the strongest case, I believe, is made in the happiness letter that he wrote to Nancy Rigdon when she rebuffed him when he initially proposed her to be one of his secret plural brides. The argument that he makes is that because he is a prophet of God and has been given special permission by God to do something which would be considered immoral and abominable in any other context, then she should submit to him. Well, that argument itself, that the reason that you do things that are considered immoral and abominable in any other context is because a man claiming to speak for God tells you God told him to do it, that is the root of the problem. And that is why these men are dangerous, and why the process of learning the danger inherent to that relationship, to that claim, and freeing yourself from it is so powerful and liberating that invitations like President Uchtdorf's to come back to the church and feel like you belong are hollow and short-sighted and frankly insulting and an affront to anyone who has gone through that journey.
It is to learn of Jesus Christ, to study his words, to hear him, and to follow him by actively participating in this great work. I invite you to come and belong. You don't have to be perfect. You only have to have a desire to develop your faith and draw near to him each day. Our part is to love and serve God, and to love and serve God's children. As you do so, God will encircle you with his love, joy, and certain guidance through his life and this life, even under the most serious circumstances and even beyond. Of this I testify and leave you my blessing in deep gratitude and love for each one of you. In the sacred name of our Savior, our Master, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Well, that's his talk. He closes it out with, again, this hat trick that they play where they tell people that all you need to do is listen to and follow Christ. Christ is the center of all of it. And the other end of that stick is that they are the ones who define the communications with Christ, what Christ demands of you, how you can feel that you are at peace with God. All of those things are defined by the requirements that they set upon you. And if you want to know what those requirements are, you just have to follow the trail of salvation. And you have to say that, the reason that people have a yearning for God is all of this fear, uncertainty, and doubt that we have in life. What happens in the hereafter? What is my purpose? Well, the story of salvation gives you that purpose. And it's that carrot that they dangle out in front of you. That's what I want. And so then they will tell you, well, if you want this, then you have to do this, this, and this. And in the church, of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, if you want that potential to have what God has, to have your eternal family, well, then you need to be married in the temple, and you need to have received your endowment and endure to the end. Okay, well, what does it take then to get into the temple and to be married in the temple? Well, the only way that you can do that is to be able to pass a worthiness interview for a temple recommend. Okay, well, what are the requirements for that temple recommend interview? Well, you have to agree to certain statements that you believe in and support. And that includes a belief in the restoration and a support and sustaining of the men who have inherited the authority of what Joseph Smith claimed to have restored, the prophet as he lives now, the apostles. And you have to sustain them. So you have to tie your belief to them. It's not just to God, it's to them. You have to go to your meetings. You have to be honest in your fellow dealings. All of these different things that the church itself betrays in how it acts as an institution. But you have to then subordinate your life to the demands that these men make upon you. And so when you attend a general conference and they tell you how to feel about the world, how to feel about yourself, you have to accept that as authoritative over your own conscience. And that is the box that you get to live in if you want their promise of salvation. You just have to remember, the Jehovah's Witnesses have their own recipe for this. If you're a J-dub, you can say, what is salvation? Well, it's living in paradise, in the earth restored after the great tribulation with Jehovah and all of the, fellow witnesses. Okay, well, what is required in order to do that? Well, you have to stay in faith with Jehovah. You have to obey all of the restrictions and all of the commandments and all of the guidances that are given to you from the governing body of the church who claim to speak for Jehovah. And that just is a different shaped box that you have to live in for your whole life in order to get their particular carrot. You just have to realize that paradigm of some group offering you salvation and then restricting and binding your life to their commandment with this moral principle of obedience being at the heart of it all, that just gives you the shape of the prison that you're going to be in that. Now, this isn't an argument against religion in general for people who are willing to approach religion and faith from a perspective that allows people to define their own relationship with God. And you could say, well, you're just making a case against religion. Well, there are religions that can be empowering and liberating for people to find a community that is defined by allowing individuals their own journey. And then you can find more restrictive and harmful ones. And one way to find out if a religion is harmful is to find out if there are support groups for recovering from that religion. So we could, as Mormons, as faithful believing Mormons, look at the fact that there are a bunch of ex-Scientology recovery help groups. And we can say, oh yeah, there's a lot of spiritual abuse, a lot of exploitation and just distorting of your worldview that goes on in Scientology. It makes sense that there's a whole bunch of support groups for people recovering from that. And then you could find out that there's ex-Jehovah's Witness support groups. You'd be like, yeah, the size and extent of that support group is proportional to the harm inherent to that group. Well, see if you can find an ex-Unitarian Universalist support group, and you're not going to find one because that organization isn't defined by things which are psychologically and spiritually harmful to individuals. It's just a community for people to come together and to work on their own spiritual journey defined by themselves. If you Google ex-Mormon support groups, you're going to find a heck of a lot of them out there because there is a great deal of harm in how the church compels people to view themselves and the world around them. And it may not sound like something harmful to some people, but just the fact that they do what they do with the power and authority of God's voice is inherently harmful. And you can find, I've talked about this a few other ways, but if you join an organization and they just say, the purpose of our organization is to help children, it sounds like a good organization and you can join it. But then once you join it, they say, well, we define helping children now as something that God has told us exactly how to do it, and you can only see helping children through the way that we see it. And that means if you're a woman, you have to be a mother. If you explore any other expression or outlet in your life other than being a mother, well, then you are betraying God's highest purposes for you. And we may tolerate you, but you really need to understand that you're not living up to your full potential in this paradigm. And so the harm that comes from that is because people have a huge variety of different values and potential and ways that they would like to choose and direct their life in. And when you place that false construct, which is empowered only by the notion that God defines what is right and wrong for each individual, well, then they have to shape their lives around the contours of this false paradigm of authority. And so they themselves have now distorted their existence. They're shot at life according to these false claims of authority. And it's something that is very humbling and painful to wake up from, because you realize that the different choices and priorities that you would have otherwise made for your life were distorted and robbed from you because of this false notion of divine communication and divine authority that these men claimed. Anyway, so Uchtdorf does it. He does it in style, and he makes you feel good about himself, but it's still toxic. And, occasionally we get him speaking in ways that we wouldn't expect, calling us children, telling us that we will belong. Belonging is not something that you can simply tell people that they will do. Belonging is a culture that the leaders would need to build into the hearts and minds of the church by promoting an approach to people in all of their varieties that is accepting, that is loving, one that is not only filtered through the spectrum of what the brethren say is acceptable for you to tolerate. All right, so we're going to go ahead and accept calls now. If you would like to give us your own thoughts on Uchtdorf's talk, you can call 210-422-2222 and share your perspective on it. Let's see. We can go back to full screen on this. Let's go back and see what some of the comments are. All right. Jeremy Nichols says, it's only a hot take if you comment on it within a day of its happening. That may be true in the world of social media, but for me, I define a hot take by my reactions the first time I see it. So that's what this was. I had not seen that before. It's funny, too, because if you go to the ex-Mormon subreddit now, people are really, they've caught on to this unruly child thing, and they're almost proud of it. And I can understand it for, just the phrase unruly, somebody who is not willing to be ruled. If you've got people claiming false authority to have domination over your mind and your life, then being unruly is exactly what you want to be in order to claim your own individual identity and to claim the authority and power to direct your life as you see fit. That doesn't mean that you're empowered to go and hurt other people, but it means that the choices that you want to make that are drawn from your own priorities and your own judgment, you are free to make without men claiming false authority ruling over you. So absolutely, if you want to claim being an unruly child, then you can do that. The funny aspect of that is the child thing. And that is just like, you believe as church leaders that we who have chosen to direct our lives according to our own conscience are children, when it is actually the people whose moral framework is defined by obedience. What do the brethren say? That's how I'm going to live my life. That is a much more childish perspective, because that is when you are children and you're completely dependent upon your parents for safety, for shelter, for nurturing you through those years of your life where you are naive, where you don't have the wisdom and judgment and experience. That is a childish perspective, but the church wants people to perpetually be in that state of being a child, so that your naivety, your lack of being able to work through things on your own makes you completely dependent upon their authority and their decrees. You can say, well, I'm not naive. I think through these things on my own. I've read the gospel doctrine manuals, and I've read, well, all you're doing is framing your mind according to things that they tell you are permissible. You're not going beyond that. And I think as a faithful member, you would agree with me if we saw some Scientologist saying, well, I think for myself, I've read every document that L. Ron Hubbard ever wrote, and I agree with all of it. You'd be like, you don't really think for yourself if you're simply saying that you agree with what your religious authority said. And that's one of the things where it's one of the talking points anytime I'm talking with people who are trying to defend the church. And frequently they'll say, well, I don't just blindly follow the brethren. I think for myself. And we're like, okay, well, if that is the case, can you describe one thing that the church is currently teaching, a policy that the church has on something important that you disagree with and that you think they got wrong? And there's not really, I have yet to have anyone that really is willing to say something. They may say, well, I didn't quite agree with the November 2015 announcement that the children of married gay parents can't get baptized. Okay, well, if that's the case, can you show me some place on Facebook or anywhere where you felt empowered and free to express your disagreement? And how do you frame the correction that was eventually made? Was it that they acknowledged their error and corrected it? Or was it that they claimed that this was simply another revelation for God? And if you dig down into the details of that particular disagreement, invariably it always comes up to continuing to follow the brethren, and they are communicating the will of God. I mean, in order for you to actually acknowledge that the men would claim that God revealed something to them and they did it, but they got it wrong, it opens up a huge can of worms about the nature of their authority. And that's where the other shoe has to drop eventually. Okay, so if you would like to join the conversation, you can call 210-422-2222. Let's see, we're up right around the hour mark, so I don't know that I can milk this for much longer if there are no calls. What other comments do we have? All right, we got a call. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
Jonathan Streeter, you magnificent bastard.
Is this Gimpy Geezer? I'm trying to place the name with this.
Gimpy Geezer. Gimpy Geezer. And on Facebook, Randy Reagan.
Oh, okay. Hey, what's going on? What's on your mind?
Hey there. Hey, I don't understand why people aren't calling in, because you have touched on some really good stuff here. I've got some thoughts, if I may share.
Please do.
Yeah, I think you really nailed it when you said that a church organization, whatever, tells you that you are broken and then sells you the cure, and that's so true. That's what happened to me. In the Mormons or LDSs are big on indoctrination, and that's what happened to me. I've talked to you before. I'm almost 60. I joined at age 20. And so I was, joined basically as a young adult, and then spent many years as a TBM. But I had a shelf. And what's interesting is if you do have life experience before joining the church and you're not, raised in it, I have seen many times of with local leaders manipulation and stuff like that. And since I'd had some life experience, I'm like, nah, that's bullshit. And when people here's a little thing I learned. If like somebody would say, hey, there's a stake meeting next Thursday, you need to be there because of whatever calling I had. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to be able to make that. Nobody checked with me. I got stuff going on. No, you've got to be there. I'm saying, I'm not going to be there. And I've had people over me in whatever calling, hierarchy, start yelling at me. I'm like, I'm just being honest. But what everybody does is, hey, you got a meeting next Thursday or whatever, and everybody I paid attention after that. Everybody nods their head, and then they don't show up. So it's like, that's for being honest. Hey, I do really have some thoughts about what you said, and you really stirred up a lot of stuff in my mind. Good stuff. John, you do so damn good. You really do. You're doing a good job, and the way you point a lot of the stuff out, you're really on point. You articulate it so well. I'm jealous that you could come up, articulate it so well. I guess that's the years of everything. But I want to a couple things I thought about when you were talking about Joseph Smith and the way he was wheeling and dealing back in the day. I was a seminary teacher for 3 years, and when we taught when I taught Doctrine and Covenants, I noticed a pattern within D&C I had not noticed before, and that is that often Joseph Smith is living. He has a one-way connection to God himself, and so people would come up to him and go, Joseph, can you inquire of the Lord? What is my standing before the Lord? So they're practically falling into his hands. And this happened several times. Well, what is my standing before the Lord? And then Joseph's, and here's Joseph's power, because he had the craziness and the balls to say this phrase, thus saith the Lord. Mm-hmm. These guys these days aren't saying thus saith the Lord. I mean, thus saith the committee, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, probably.
Whom it may concern.
Yeah. No, Joseph Smith, thus saith the Lord, you shall go on a 3-year mission without purse or script. Your wife is attractive. I shall be on that and up under her petty skirts, brother, when you are gone. And when you come back, I may be sitting down having dinner with your wife as you go proclaim the gospel and suffer. By the way, going out without purse or script, that was a bad gig back in the day. Anyway, so, but here's... You reminded me of something, and I want to share this with you. Tell me if you agree with me. I learned something a long time ago. I have, I've been, even though I'm half goofy, I do have a gift for teaching, I'm told, and it seems to be true over the years. That's why I taught a lot of Sunday school classes, and I was always getting a lot of teaching callings. And also, on a professional level, I did some teaching and stuff. One of the best tips I got, like 25 years or so ago, is from a fellow teacher, and she says, I found that if I can connect whatever I'm trying to teach them, a concept or principle or whatever the thing is that they don't understand yet, if I can connect it to something that they already know, that makes it so much easier. And she was right, and I remembered it, and I tried to implement that into what I did, and it always worked. Always turned out pretty well. But see, that's what Joseph Smith did. Joseph Smith, he was told to baptize, and then Oliver baptized him. That's where the Aaronic priesthood authority first came. It's like, well, geez, if I know that John the Baptist baptized Jesus, I know that. Well, that's good enough for me. Oh, wait, Peter, James, and John came with the higher priesthood. Wait, they were on the Mount of Transfiguration. And Peter was like the head of the church after Jesus, that was resurrected and all that. Oh, that's good enough for me. And I've thought about that. I remembered, I get tickled, and I thought about this many times over the years. And I don't know if you've seen it, but I know down south there was a lesser-known cartoon. I always liked cartoons, as a kid. We always on Saturday morning cartoons and all that. But there was one called Pixie and Dixie, and they're two little southern mice, little troublemakers, like Heckle and Jekyll, but they're mice, and it's not Tom and Jerry. Pixie and Dixie, and they had the southern accent too. Hey Pixie, hey Dixie, and they always get into trouble. Now the cat, there's got to be a cat. His name was Jinx, and they would always a running gag. I think on every little cartoon episode, they would roll up on Jinx. The cat with some sidestepping and bullshitting and hitting with something, and he would go, well, that sounds logical. And that was the catchphrase for him. That sounds logical. And that's that's what I did. And many people do. They came to the church learning about it. That sounds logical. But Joseph Smith, like you were saying about, was it the Nauvoo house, the hotel? Yes, and thus saith the Lord, forget all the world's calamities. You are $50 per share for you and 50 for you, and I'm going to, the top room was for me and my honeys only. I'm going to have a stable of these. This is where my bitches go. Thus saith the Lord. But they fell for it. Adam on Diamond. I think people are doing stuff there in preparation for the second coming as we speak, I think. But it's like, see that spot over there? That's where the Garden of Eden originally was. Oh my God. See that?
Didn't he say there was like a stack of stones? He's like, that's the altar that Adam built.
Exactly. Oh, and by the way, I found out the people, the people that work for the church, to maintain it or whatever, they're always replacing the rocks on the altar because they're always disappearing. People are walking off with these artifacts. Okay. And I had one of my dearest friends. He had his wife's parents. Both of them were temple workers in the Orlando, Florida temple, and so I got to hear some insights there. There's the beautiful chandeliers and light fixtures and all the hanging crystal and everything. Well, on the ones that are on the walls that are still, they're not a full chandelier hanging, but you could reach them. They're very beautiful. Oh my God, the crystal alone had to be a bazillion bucks. Anyway, people in the temple were walking away. They would take one of these little crystal pieces off the light fixture as a memento. So they're stealing from the temple. if that makes any sense. But anyway, but Joseph Smith really did. He was a master. Listen, he may not have been educated, but I know people that are very, very intelligent, much smarter than me. I know a guy who is like super computer genius crazy. He plays like grand level master chess games for fun and beats it, And I taught the kids I taught. One of them had almost a photographic memory. This guy, he can do whatever he wants to do. He's got that kind of memory. I believe that Joseph Smith had these types of gifts. I mean, he wasn't formally educated, but he was smart as can be. He had a good memory. He could, do this type of thing. But when Uchtdorf says Joseph Smith was like you and me, no, he wasn't. He wasn't, because Joseph Smith, I don't know, you would know more because I know you're a doctor, whatever the field is, he was a sex addict of some sort. I don't know what strain, but he obviously had a problem with his libido. He just couldn't get enough. I don't know even how he physically did it, but
well, I don't know if it's even an issue of libido as much as it is, somebody who's willing to do things that you and I would never even, we couldn't cross that threshold, just to lie and deceive people in order to get things. And I think there is a character, a nature of somebody who's willing to do those things that we just couldn't do.
I'm sure you have seen this. I can't think of his name. They're over in Australia. And they show him teaching people. People are listening to him on the internet or showing up in purpose. And he writes on the blackboard, "I am Jesus, deal with it." He says he's Jesus reincarnate. And guess what? Fortunately, his cute little girlfriend, Mary, she's Mary. She was Mary in a past life. And oh my God. So Mary and Jesus are back together, and people believe it. This is in our day and age. So especially way back when in those older times, it would be easy to see how somebody could get misled. And what a thing it has been construed to be. I think Joseph Smith would be very surprised if he knew that people in Adam we're visiting of one of his little bullshit whims, or Zelf or whatever. Oh, hey, by the way, John, you would know this. Who is oft quoted, but who first said that God would never allow the prophet to lead the church astray? Who originally said that? Do you know? I can't think of who it was. I mean,
one of the I think it was Joseph F. Smith. One of the general authorities told this story about another authority telling him that this other authority told it to him when he was young, and so I think it goes back to Joseph F. Smith, or Joseph Fielding Smith.
And so it's like, okay, well, the prophet can't lead us astray. We know that. It's like, well, who said that? Well, one of the prophets. Well, okay. I mean,
circular logic.
Hey, and before I forget, one thing here before I forget, if you ever, another thing which you were talking made me think of this, there's a comedian named Patton Oswalt. He's one of my favorites. He's funny. If you don't like cursing, he doesn't curse too bad, but, it comes out. But he has a bit, all you got to do is Patton Oswalt and Sky Cake. It's called Sky Cake. It's like a 5 or 6 minute bit. It's so funny. And some of the stuff you were talking about is this Sky Cake. The Mormonism brand, we have our own particular brand of Sky Cake. And what amazes me, I've never been more interested in General Conference than I am now, because once you recognize the patterns of indoctrination, reinforcing, the doctrine and everything, just pounding it home. And a lot of people, including myself, were very disappointed with Uchtdorf, with the unruly children thing. Yeah. But after that, and you are one of the few people who are able to like break this down point by point, and again, it's like opening your eyes. So I think what the work you're doing is super important, and it's certainly sometimes it triggers, but a lot of times it just brings back memories and experiences. And I don't want to call and run my mouth every time, but I enjoy the show. But I don't understand why people are calling. And by the way, John, you're about to break 8,000 subscribers. Good for you. You're really close. I've been rooting for you. I don't understand why it's not over 100,000. I don't understand.
I don't know. I just kind of do what I do, and I try not to pay too much attention to that.
And I'm not saying my only point is like more people need to see some of your work and everything. But
well, I appreciate that.
Yeah. And hey, another great video. You certainly got me thinking, and yeah, you're on point. And hey, I swear to God, John, if you want a nice laugh, Pat Oswald Sky Cake.
All right, I'll definitely check it out.
All right, thanks, man.
Thanks for the call. All right, take care. All right. So if you would like to jump in on the conversation, you can call 210-422-2222. The phone lines are open again. We did a point-by-point kind of reaction video to President Uchtdorf. Looks like we got a call. Let's take a look. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, John, this is Nathan. It's great to talk to you.
Hey, Nathan. What's on your mind?
Well, I got a couple comments on the talk that we were just listening to.
Yeah.
And I have a couple of questions for you as well. And then, if I can, I have a couple of general questions that I was hoping that you could answer about, church members and whatnot.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so a couple of the things just related to you. One, I think everybody wants to see Evil Apostate come back out at some time. So
yeah, that's a common request.
Yeah, love Evil Apostate. Another one is that a lot of times when these live commentaries come on, I'm not sure how most people are finding or being aware of this. Sometimes if I'm on Facebook or whatnot, it'll pop up and say, you have a live feed. But I'm wondering if maybe it'd be better to send out an email or something like that to people beforehand.
I think if you hit follow on the page, and then on YouTube, if you subscribe and then hit the bell on the video, then you'll get notified anytime something happens. And I wish my life was more organized where it could be like every Tuesday at 3:00 I'll do such and such, and then people could just predict it. But I just kind of do this in the small snippets of time that I get between other things, and I'm not a big planner, so I just kind of do it when I do it. But that would be the thing, though, is if you just follow the page, and I think there might be some levels of following on the page where you can make it where you're notified of everything. And then sometimes when I know I'll have time, I'll just set up the video the night before, and so you'll have more lead time. Other times it'll be like 20 minutes, and then that's how much notice you'll have.
All right. Fair enough. So a couple questions just related to the talk with Uchtdorf. And one of those is that in that talk, he makes specifically quite a bit at the beginning. He says, hey, do members want everything spelled out? And he I forget all the language that he uses, but he uses something of that nature. Do we need to follow every single detail, right? And just my thought on that real quick, and you can expound on it either here or later, is that is exactly what the church does. Is they expound everything to the point of what you can drink, what you can eat, what movies you can watch, how late you can be out at night, especially if you're a youth, what length dresses you should wear for the women that go to BYU or other church schools. So I find that kind of very hypocritical right off the bat. And so that's one thing. Another thing was,
well, on that point, I think we'll see the church do this in a number of things where they have kind of two levels of messaging, and people who study cults will have called this indirect directives. And that's where, there's kind of like one thing that you'll say that the public is going to hear, and it's very different from the lived reality of people in the church. So, and it's tied into gaslighting, where he can say, members don't want every question answered. You don't want to have everything told to you. That's ridiculous. We would get tired of that type of micromanagement. And then we have President Elder Bednar in a local general conference tell people there is nothing in your life that should not be affected by this church. And then he goes on a list: what you drink, what you eat, what you wear, the friends you have, the choices you make. And it's like this whole other thing and then he says, all of these things have to be affected by your discipleship in this church. And you're absolutely right. There's a complete hypocrisy to the lived experience of people in the church. Regardless of how Uchtdorf may say, we don't want that level of micromanaging. Well, we have that level of micromanaging. It's just that when they are trying to kind of cast the spell of, you don't need answers to your questions about Joseph Smith and legitimacy of the history and authority of the church. You don't need answers to the contradictions inherent to prior teachings about racism and polygamy. You don't need answers to these things. Well, then they can pull out this notion that, we don't want to get the answers to everything, because that would be, annoying to live under that micromanagement. But there's a difference between answers to inherent contradictions and problems in church history and the church telling you how to live your life. We don't want the church telling us how to live our life, but we do want answers on these problems that speak directly to the authority that the church has to tell us how to live our life, because that's what the church is doing.
Right. And that, I think that is so abundantly clear in the fact that the church leaders who, claim to be prophets, seers, and revelators cannot identify where the Book of Mormon took place, right? And I think that would be one of the most basic thing that they could do. So, yeah, it's really unfortunate that they continue to do this. Another thing that I caught in the Uchtdorf talk was he starts talking about obeying Christ, right? He's like, well, one of our things, or one of the things for the apostles in the day is they need to obey Christ. And then the very next sentence is a hard transition. He tries to make it a soft transition into, well, modern day, we need to obey Joseph Smith. And so there's this correlation going back and forth between Joseph Smith and Jesus Christ. And he, and basically, to my mind, that correlation is saying that we need to equate one with the other.
Yeah, and I agree that he does it in a soft, indirect way. He talks about the apostles following Christ, and then he sets up the model that Joseph followed Christ, and then says that we also need to follow Christ. And left unspoken is the reality in the church that it is the leaders who tell us what that means, following Christ, and so that the lived experience of Mormons under their authority is that we have to follow the leaders because the leaders speak for Christ. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and I found that just completely manipulative. Yeah. So I had two other questions, and you can answer these offline, and that is not specifically on this talk, but one of them is, why do members continuously believe in revelation when there's constantly not being any revelation pushed out? And with that is, why are they for instance, examples of that is the Come Follow Me, and everybody's, this is revelation. It's amazing, when it's a book full of nothing and fluff, right? Or the latest General Conference, the Proclamation, which is nothing either, So I'm curious about that. And then the other question is, why are LDS members so superstitious? So example, the COVID-19, the earthquake in Salt Lake City, which, you would think that's the first earthquake that's ever happened on the earth, much less in the most recent time. Moroni dropping his trump, and all of a sudden, or his trumpet, and all of a sudden, all havoc. This is the second coming. And I'm wondering if this is just based on our religious background, in the fact that we've come to accept these superstitions, and we become superstitious, people based on that, or based on our religious teachings, or is that something that you think is ascribed to, like even the Book of Mormon and whatnot?
I think, all these questions are related, and they tie into the very real human psychology concept that our minds try to find connections and try to find meaning. And particularly when our minds exist in a circumstance that has had all sorts of stories be built into the narrative of our reality. And so if we're told that truth can come through certain feelings and that God has his hand in directing the affairs of men for his purposes, then it gives us a way to understand the world. And this is not unique to Mormonism. This is, you'll find in mythology, you'll find in religion, is that, when something happens, we try to find the stories that give it meaning and relevance for what has been foretold. And, the clearest examples of this just outside of Mormonism that's everyone's familiar with is if you look at the prophecies of Nostradamus. And he gave some vague things that then people find things that coincide with reality that happen later, and they say, look, he foretold this. And the greater number of those connections that they can find will make it seem like his powers of prophecy are greater. Well, just understanding this. Now, the church, I think, has wised up by not declaring anything specifically to be a revelation. Then they have more leeway to change it in the future. And they tripped up recently because when President Nelson came out and talked about the November 2015 policy, excluding the children of gay people from married people, the church did not call it a revelation. Monson didn't call it a revelation. He, as the president of the Court of the 12 Apostles, gave a talk to the youth, and that was the only time where they attached the name revelation to it. And that kind of tied their hands, so that if they made a future change, they had to contextualize it in a way that accounted for it being a revelation in the past and not a policy in the past. But I think the church is learning from that. The more things that they put out without necessarily giving it the label of revelation, members will see it as revelation. And much like Nostradamus did some stuff and the people say, oh, you predicted the future, because they find elements that would seem to make it seem like he predicted the future. Well, church members are doing the same thing. The church shortened to 2 hours. They have a manual that has the same lesson that everybody's supposed to go on. Well, they can say that now that we're all in lockdown under coronavirus, they can draw those connections and say, well, this must have been revelation that was based on what the prophet or God knew was going to happen, and it prepared us for this. And that's just the same concept of taking things that happen in our world, drawing from the stories and the narrative and the mythology that we live under, and finding meaning, finding patterns in those things. And those patterns, we're told they can be affirming to our beliefs. And if they affirm the worldview that we have as Mormons, believing that the Mormon predictions and prophecy and power are real, then there's a great deal of incentive to find those connections, because they make our belief stronger, and they make any doubt that we might have about believing them, dissipate somewhat. So, and that is a form of superstition. So it's the same thing when we see earthquakes and we see these calamities happen. Well, then we can draw on what we're foretold will happen in the end times and do it. And we're not the only ones that do it right now. The Jehovah's Witnesses are having that same phenomenon, where they're seeing the COVID-19 events as things that were foretold in preparation for the Great Tribulation, that they are, it's increasing their control over the minds of believing members, because that narrative and that story seems to be becoming fulfilled. And so the fear inherent to that increases the desire that people have for the comfort of salvation that they claim to be able to provide. And so it binds them closer to that organization.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. You did jog my memory, and I do have one additional very short question, and that is, are you going to do any more videos with the 3 apostates?
Yeah, actually, we did just a couple of weeks ago, in the midst of this coronavirus, in the early days of it. We kind of got together with Lloyd Evans and Chris Shelton, and if you go to Chris Shelton's channel, which I think is Thinker at Large or something like that, or if you just Google Three Apostates and coronavirus or current events, then you'll see a conversation where we had where we look at how each of these various organizations are dealing with modern events, particularly when two of them at least have this end times narrative that people are drawing from in order to make conclusions and connections like we've been discussing. And ironically, Scientology, which really doesn't have an Armageddon scenario, has probably done some of the more restrictive things to its members. So definitely check that out over at the Three Apostates.
Yeah, I think they just came out, Scientology, with they were cleaning government vehicles or something like that.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, some kind of article about that somewhere, maybe it was a police force or something, I forget, or maybe it was a county. But okay, yeah, I will take a look at that, and I appreciate your time. Thank
All
you
right,
very
thanks
much.
for the call. All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. So if those of you that aren't familiar with the Three Apostates, a few years ago, I got connected with Chris Shelton, who talks and blogs and does video episodes about his experience previously being a fairly high-ranking member of Scientology's organization and leaving that and going through that process. So he's able to speak from the Scientology experience. I speak from the Mormon experience, and then another activist, Lloyd Evans, who is a former Jehovah's Witness, speaks from their experience. And we kind of get together and compare notes on how our various prior faith traditions are dealing with concepts and themes and principles. And it's very illuminating to see the Jehovah's Witness flavor of phobia induction or exploiting family relationships, or all the different things that we experience in Mormonism. To see how Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses do it is very informative. So check that out. Okay, so Me Too mentions Joseph said that Emma would be destroyed, and if Martin Harris didn't hand over his coins, he would be destroyed. I think he's pointing out a dimension of Joseph using the voice for God that is particularly ominous, where he was not only using the authoritative nature inherent to saying, "Thus saith the Lord," but he flavored it further still with divine threats upon disobedience. So it was not only that God was saying something, but God was also telling specific individuals, if you didn't do what I say, then you are going to be destroyed. And that, I think, when we were talking in the call before about, some people just don't go that far, I think using "thus saith the Lord" is a degree of deception that most people would just be like, I can't do that. That's so obviously manipulative, and it's just immoral and unethical to prey upon believing people like that. I would never do that. But then adding on top of that, using your "thus saith the Lord" to threaten people if they disobey you, there's just a degree of depravity associated with that is just beyond the pale. So, that's Joseph for you. Okay, Joshua Kemp says, the man is not stupid. He cannot seriously believe what he's saying. And he's talking about Dieter Uchtdorf. And the thing is, I don't think that any of the brethren are stupid. It's weird. There's this idea that people who are members of cults or people who join certain high-demand religions, they have to be ignorant and stupid. And I think that is not really the right way. Excuse me. Have a sneeze. It's going to come. No, it's not. All right. You can find groups where there are very highly intelligent people as part of the group. If you Google I think it's called the Shinriko cult in Japan, it's built around this guy who, there were some ricin bombings or biochemical attacks in Japan a few years ago in their train stations, and they were tied to this Shinriko group. And the reason that they had access to that type of biochemical agent is because a lot of their members were educated, like PhD level biochemists and physicists, and all of these highly educated people that were still under a spell of indoctrination and deception, which gave them their belief in their group, belief that was so powerful that they were willing to commit what we see as atrocities on the outside in the name of what they saw as righteousness. And so, somebody's vulnerability to deception and to indoctrination does not disappear once you get an education or is not dependent on your IQ. And a lot of naivety about the mechanisms of manipulation and deception are, I think, attributable to that. If you don't know the ways in which you can be defrauded and the ways you are likely to be defrauded then or deceived, then those red flags don't pop up, and it's harder to detect them. And people's beliefs color the choices that they make and what they do with the other aspects of their life. Now, that being said, if we look then at the men like Uchtdorf, who are the prophets and apostles, regardless of whether or not they are awake to the fraudulent nature of the church or the deceptive nature of the church, they are in a position where they have a whole bunch of incentives to continue it. And they're also very capable. I think anyone in that position could come up with a narrative where you could see what you were doing in perpetuating this deception as for the greater good. You could say, well, even if it's not true, it still helps people to have purpose in life. And, what I can do in my position of influence with my deeper understanding is I can teach things in a way that, reduces the negative parts of the faith and promotes the positive parts of the faith. And if that keeps me in my position where I have zero to worry about in my old age, I don't have to worry about medical bills. I get to travel the world. I have to give a bunch of talks and I have to go to meetings and everything, but people adore me wherever I go. Those are things that people can be very alluring and very enticing to people no matter where they are in life. And if it's tied to this enviable material security, then it's going to be very hard to compel someone to step outside of that, particularly when they can find reasons to believe that they're doing good in that position. So I think a lot of us thought Uchtdorf maybe was in that mindset. And then when we see little glimpses into him adopting the much more controlling, unethical tone of framing those who leave the church, for example, as he did in this talk, then it's harder to accept that. And then we have, Nathan commenting that he thinks that Uchtdorf may have been told to get in line and follow the program. And he observed that starting with him giving that slobbering praise to President Nelson is weird and borders on worship. And that's absolutely true. If you look at Dieter Uchtdorf's prior talks, can't recall any time where he started his talk slobbering on the boots of the prophet. But, he is in the position of having been institutionally chastised, in that there's kind of a progression that happens for the apostles, and once you get in the first presidency, you generally stay there until you are senior enough to become the prophet, and he did not do that. He was removed from the first presidency and put back down in the quorum of the 12 apostles when Nelson became the prophet. And some people think that that's because he was more forthcoming about the problems of the church. He was speaking in a much more ecumenical vocabulary than other leaders generally do. Okay. All right, if you would like to join the conversation, you can call 210-422-2222. Let's see what other comments that we have. Uchtdorf is like an ex who's always begging for you to come back. It's not a bad analogy, but you would have to add that he's begging for you to come back, telling you that the reasons that you left him in the first place were all overblown and ridiculous and not changing in the meantime at all. So, and it's just totally out of touch with the real nature of why people leave. And the brethren know why people leave. They've been handed the results of surveys. They've conducted their own surveys. They know why people leave, but rather than address those issues, which they can't, because if they were to actually address those issues, it would invalidate their claims of authority, then they have to, pour out all of these other ideas that the believing members can then think are how their loved ones left the church. Oh, well, they were just unruly children. They were infants. If they had enough strength, then they could have kept the faith and held on to what they previously knew to be true. All right. Let's see here. What other... Okay, Clark Abode says, Uchtdorf uses more flattery and doublespeak than any of the other LDS apostles. He's one of the biggest manipulators. It's sad to see ex-Mormons fall for his love bombing and gaslighting. So I think this is one of those things where if you understand the harmful and destructive nature of the church and what it represents, then the leader who makes the most compassionate, the most inviting, the most compelling argument for you to come back into its clutches is by definition the most dangerous leader. And looking at it from that perspective, I could definitely see how Uchtdorf may be, the most manipulative because he makes the church seem the most inviting. And the difference is, though, like the inviting, accepting, belonging church that he describes in his talks is very different from the experience that anyone who returns to the church is actually going to have when they live in it. And really the only way to be in the church and to not have that experience is to exist in the church as a member, but completely disregard any claim of authority, any dominion over your life, or any accepting any notion of looking at the world through the lens that the brethren give you. You basically have to just ignore them completely, but still, attend meetings. I remember like the last few times I attended church, like I'd noticed like there were people in the background who were like playing Angry Birds on their phone in the middle of priesthood lesson, and I can imagine years before I would have been like, well, that's not righteous. You're supposed to be paying attention, but it's like, that's what you do just to make the time pass. All right. Okay. So, Beverly asks, are there any broadcasts with Luna in the works? And for those of you that don't know, if you look on the Thinker of Thoughts YouTube channel for Undue Influence and General Conference, one of the first things that I did when I started using YouTube as a platform for some of the stuff was teaming up with Luna Lindsay. She goes by Luna Corbden now, who has a background in really kind of taking a look at the models of control that people have put to understand how other high demand religions use. They're called methods of undue influence. Some people call it cult mind control or something like that. But those are just words for describing the various different techniques that groups have. Well, we started looking at General Conference talks and seeing if we could identify those same techniques being used in the talks as a way to kind of deconstruct them and understand how those talks have power and influence over the minds of believing members. It was a great experience for me to do those talks with Luna because I learned a great deal in how to identify and work through those issues. And I think of all the things that she and I have done together, that's probably been the things that we've gotten the most positive feedback. So if you haven't had a chance to go through those, we started early on trying to get through all of General Conferences, but never were able to really do that. And it's been harder to get together and coordinate schedules since then. But I've reached out to her recently, and she has some maybe some bandwidth opening up, and that may be something that we can put together in the future. I would like to do it because I really enjoy those as well. And I think I learned a lot just in terms of how to talk about these groups in a way that's less inflammatory from Luna's example. And so I always try to, in the back of my head when I'm talking about these things, a lot of me is just remembering the way that she talked about them in a way that was much more understanding of the believing position, because I think it's easier to kind of be detached from how you treat these things in that way. So she does a great job. She has a book which is Recovering Agency. If you Google that in Amazon.com, highly recommend it. It's in written form, goes point by point through all these things with great examples. It's a really good starting point. All right. Well, I think we haven't gotten any other calls, and we're reaching almost the 2-hour point, so we'll go ahead and close it down. I want to thank those of you that were able to attend for this hot take on the last half of Uchtdorf's talk, and we'll see if over the next few weeks we can take a look at some of the other General Conference talks using the same format here. And until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Take care.